This is episode 541 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out about the Rio Grande Foundation at riograndefoundation.org. I'm very pleased to be joined by Zach Fort. He is on the board of the New Mexico Shooting Sports Association and a regular guest on Tipping Point, New Mexico. Welcome back, Zach.
Thanks for having me on again. I appreciate it.
Yeah, anything going on exciting on guns in New Mexico?
Only kind of the focal point of the gun control debate in the entire country is kind of focused on New Mexico right now,
Yeah,
and what our governor attempted is the key word here to do.
yeah, it's been an area that has driven a great deal of national attention, and I welcome it because it has focused people who normally may not be able to point to New Mexico on a map of the United States and highlighted just how radical our governor really is. And we've been saying this for quite some time, but it's been welcome in the attention and focus approach to this governor.
Most definitely. I mean, we saw because one thing I want to iterate for your listeners really quickly is, the order itself was on guns, but there's a larger concept here, and that is the governor's emergency powers and what a governor can and cannot do solely through executive action. So even if if you're listening to this podcast and you don't really care about the issue of the Second Amendment that much, what you should be caring about is how much executive power can a governor have to just act unilaterally to suspend not only the state constitution but federal constitutional rights as well. So that's kind of that's the larger issue at play here. It's not just the issue of guns; it's also the issue of limits on executive power. And she's she's a governor, not a dictator.
Yeah, and Rio Grande Foundation, we are gun sympathetic, Second Amendment sympathetic, as we are to the entire Bill of Rights and the rest of the U.S. Constitution. But we're not a gun expert organization like you and the New Mexico Shooting Sports Association, but we have focused and will continue to focus on limiting and revising the ways in which the governor can seize unilateral control. Efforts were made to limit her to a 45, or other governors to 45 days. That needs to be updated. You can't just have a 45-day time limit on an emergency anymore. You have to make sure that there are certain subjects that the governor cannot simply call a emergency and say, well, no one can carry a gun for 30 days or 44 days or something crazy like that. But talk briefly, New Mexico Shooting Sports Association. What is your role there, and what does the organization do?
Yeah, so New Mexico Shooting Sports Association has been around since 1935. We are the pro Second Amendment advocacy group in New Mexico. We are an affiliate of the National Rifle Association, but we're based here in New Mexico as a not-for-profit organization. We have our own board, which is all here in New Mexico, because we strongly believe that New Mexicans should fight for the rights of New Mexicans in New Mexico. So that's kind of our mission, is advancing the rights of New Mexicans in the legislature, and also when necessary through the courts as well. So that's basically our mission. We've been doing this a long time, and we're going to keep doing it.
So, when the governor issued this order a week and a half ago, I'm sure it was one of those. It was like a two-stage situation. She said we're going to have the public emergency, and then she announced, about 24 hours later on a Friday afternoon, here's what this emergency is going to do. So I'm sure you were very much, looking at this situation. You probably weren't informed ahead of time. I'm sure you didn't get any phone calls, but what did that kind of cause the New Mexico Shooting Sports Association to do? What has the reaction been from you, and who are some of the other national partners and New Mexico partners that you've been working with, and kind of where did this all go from the initial standpoint of this emergency?
Well, it was probably just about one of the craziest weekends of my life when that first came out. So I think it was on a Thursday. She said she's going to be issuing an order on, I guess, quote unquote, the term she uses is gun violence.
Yeah.
We kind of push back on that term a little
It's a
bit.
loaded term.
It's a loaded term, but that's just the term they use. And unfortunately, I think it's a term that people sometimes who would otherwise sympathize with our side use, but we're not going to dive too deep into that right now. But so she said she was going to announce this public health emergency on a Thursday. And then, to be really honest, we did not expect her to go as far as she did when she announced that order on Friday. We thought, we knew where she was going to say something around, funding for different programs, some of which are effective, some of which are not so effective, and we knew something was coming, but we didn't know exactly what. And I have to admit, we were not expecting her to basically just try to nullify the Second Amendment in Bernalillo County for 30 days. From the moment she said that, basically my phone just rang nonstop for 72 hours. People were calling me before that press conference was over saying like, wait, did you just see what happened? From that point on, basically it was just all hands on deck. I spent the next several days talking with attorneys here in New Mexico, attorneys nationally, because there was so much interest. Everyone from all these different groups nationally were calling us, trying to figure out what's going on, securing plaintiffs for lawsuits, securing local counsel for lawsuits, because a lot of these national groups don't have a full-time presence here in New Mexico. Ultimately, New Mexico Shooting Sports Association, we did sue the governor. We partnered with two organizations nationally, Firearms Policy Coalition and Second Amendment Foundation. These two organizations have, dedicated full-time staff of attorneys who focus on Second Amendment issues. They're some of the best in this country. They've worked on a lot of the biggest cases with gun rights nationally. So we wanted to make sure that we didn't want to just file a lawsuit at NMSSA. We wanted to file the best lawsuit possible to put New Mexicans in the best position possible to win this and set precedent against governors trying to do something like this. I believe that. So we were initially, we got the temporary restraining order, the TRO. I think it came about four days or so after the governor first announced her order, 4 or 5 days. There were 5 lawsuits that were heard that day. One of them was ours. There was also a lawsuit from Gun Owners of America, a lawsuit from National Association for Gun Rights, a private citizen who, acting on his own behalf, without any other groups working with him, filed a lawsuit. And then another group, I think it was like We the Patriots USA. I'm not overly familiar with them, but they were also in that first group of 5 lawsuits. Since then, there's been a couple more lawsuits filed. The NRA filed a lawsuit along with the Republican Party in state court. So we filed in federal court with the other lawsuits that were initially filed. The NRA and the Republican Party filed in state court where they're pursuing claims there. I think there were a couple of the lawsuits filed. I mean, just kind of once we got, those first 5 that were heard at that initial hearing for the TRO with a judge here, with a federal judge here in Albuquerque, that's kind of when we stopped kind of paying attention to who was filing, because there's more lawsuits have been filed. There's probably still more coming, from my understanding. So there's a whole bunch of them. But I think we put ourselves working with Second Amendment Foundation and Firearms Policy Coalition. Like I said, these are some of the best of Second Amendment attorneys, and we wanted to work with them because they have a track record of winning and a track record of doing well in big cases.
Now, most people talk about the Second Amendment, and it's clear over time that the judiciary has interpreted the Second Amendment to mean an individual right to keep and bear arms. Obviously, there's state level laws, including concealed carry permits, open carry rules and regulations, specifically in some ways that are more detailed than the Second Amendment or even the judicial interpretations of the Second Amendment. So, how did you, just kind of legal strategy wise, keep that in mind and prioritize those two things? Because the Second Amendment is obviously such a hot button for so many people, but it's a little less. I think people who may say, oh, the Second Amendment's dumb or whatever, people who are pretty hard radical left on the issue might find it harder to oppose New Mexico law, especially since this state's been a Democrat-controlled state for 90 years. I don't know. Just talk about those nuances there briefly.
So yeah, so we filed in federal court, so we're looking at a lot of federal precedent. And when talking about the Second Amendment, there's actually been dozens of cases that deal with firearms in some way or in some way, shape, or form that go all the way back to the 1800s. That all kind of point to or directly reference a right to carry a right, an individual right to own a firearm. But there's three cases that have been recent that all solidified and basically formalized this right that was already in the Constitution. So the first one was Heller versus D.C. That basically had said you had a right to own a firearm in your own home in Washington D.C. And then McDonald versus Chicago, which then said you have a right that's not just in D.C. that's in the states as well. And then most recently, the case we relied very heavily on was the Bruin case, the New York State Rifle and Pistol Association, our sister organization in New York, actually, versus the Attorney General there in New York. And the Bruin case said that you have a right to carry a firearm outside your own home for self-defense or in other lawful purposes. So we relied very heavily on that because the Bruin case, that's a very recent case, and it was very explicit that you have a right to carry a firearm outside your own home. And the governor was directly contradicting this by saying you do not have a right to carry a firearm outside your own home. So the Bruin case was very heavily referenced, not only by us, but the other groups who filed lawsuits as well. And the judge, who was a Biden appointee, this was not a conservative judge that we went before. He, at the start of the hearing, he said, told the counsel for the governor, who was not from the AG's office, is their own personal attorney from her administration staff. He said, you have a high road to climb here. That may not be quite verbatim, but that's basically what he said, because, the Bruin case made it very clear that we have a right to carry a firearm outside of our own homes to protect ourselves, assuming that you are a lawful owner of that firearm.
All right. So, kind of where do things stand legally at this point, including with, I know that the governor pulled back the, the emergency to only include basically parks and community centers and that kind of thing. But uh, are these are all legally viable, even though the governor has changed the order? And just talk about where you see this going.
Good question. So, right now, we have not withdrawn our lawsuit. Our lawsuit is still in place, and there is a preliminary injunction hearing October 3rd for our case, for our lawsuit and the other lawsuits that were with us on that TRO hearing. So the governor did amend her order. Initially, there were three sections that dealt with firearms in some way. The first section was kind of the one that drew the most attention. That was basically saying you cannot carry a firearm in counties and municipalities that meet these requirements that she set out. That basically, I think Bernalillo County and Albuquerque were the only places that met their requirements. That was the part that got the most attention, and we sued over that. That was section number one. Section number three dealt with inspections of FFLs, federally licensed firearms dealers. That was not included in our lawsuit because no action has actually happened on that yet, because there's a question of whether or not the state can actually enforce these laws, because it's basically the state trying to say they're going to enforce federal firearm laws with regards to dealers, and it's not clear if the state actually has authority to do that. I've spoken to FFLs who said they haven't seen anything from the state on this happen yet. If you are an FFL listening to this and the state has come to talk to you about this, to kind of do some type of inspection, please contact us. We would love to be able to add that section in, or potentially file a new lawsuit over that. So if you are an FFL who's been impacted by that, please contact us. And then the fourth section, the third section that dealt with firearms was section number 4 in her original order, and that actually said you can't carry in any kind of state parks or state lands, which actually would have banned a lot of hunting on any kind of state lands. And that was something, some hunters groups reached out to us. So we made sure to include that section in our lawsuit. So the part about, parks and stuff was already in section 4 that the TRO was granted for. Because not all the lawsuits covered sections 1 and 4, but ours did. So there was a TRO granted for both sections 1 and section 4, with the exception section 4, it said you can't carry a firearm in a school, but there's already the law that you can't carry a firearm in a school. So we were not challenging the carrying a firearm in a school, but we were challenging the carry a firearm in a park. And that was part of the TRO that was issued against sections 1 and 4.
Okay, now park. Let's dive into that a second here. So I didn't even contemplate the idea of a state park, but because this was focused on Bernalillo County, we have in the city of Albuquerque, thanks to Mayor Keller, restrictions on guns in city parks and recreation centers and other facilities that were deemed by the mayor to be educational. Now, that has, to my knowledge, never been challenged in court.
It has been. There's an ongoing challenge to it
There
currently.
is.
There
Okay.
was not an injunction issued against it like they had asked for, but there is a challenge to that that's moving forward. I think they're supposed to have some kind of hearings this fall on that.
Okay. So the governor's park um, order does not apply to Albuquerque city parks in Albuquerque, or does it? I don't know how that
You
language
know,
was written.
I think I would have to go back and read through
Okay.
the language really carefully. I think it's supposed to apply to parks in areas that meet those requirements that
Right.
they had laid out. What was interesting is that in her press conference, when she gave the justification for doing this, she talked about, like 15-year-olds with handguns in parks. That's already a crime. You can already charge them with a minor in possession of a handgun because you're not supposed to possess a handgun until you're 19. So a lot of the things that she referenced, like shooting a gun in a park, that's already a crime. 15-year-old carrying a handgun in a park, that's already a crime. So the things she referenced already crimes in reference and justifying this. So that's, we're still moving forward with this as far as kind of the nuances of, state parks versus city parks and where the mayor's order stands. I can't directly speak to all that because I'm not the attorney in this case. But there is litigation on that, on the mayor's order, and the TRO itself is still in place.
Now, were you surprised at the reaction of the elected officials in terms of their reticence to go along with the governor, even while being elected as Democrats, including Mayor Keller, including the sheriff, including Attorney General Torres? I was a bit pleasantly surprised, I will say, to see that level of pushback. Now, what the governor did is clearly quite radical, but still, what do you think about that?
So it's kind of I had a little bit of a mixed reaction, to be honest, because you saw some people, like Attorney General Torres, come out against it. We also saw Mimi Stewart come out in favor of it. She said she supported the governor's actions.
Right.
So yes, some people who are normally not on our side came out against it, but then also there were some people, some of these gun control groups, people like Mimi Stewart, who came out in favor of it. So the reaction among Democrats, it was not universally condemned. Senator Heinrich came out with about kind of the weakest possible statement he could on it. So
No.
Gabe Vasquez down in CD2, he came out with the weakest possible
Mm.
statement as well. I think him and Heinrich may have coordinated their statements where they didn't actually condemn the governor's actions. So that was Heinrich and Gabe Vasquez. So it was good to see people like AG Torres. And I think part of the reason that AG Torres came out against it, part of the reason that some of these people came out against it was because they didn't want, their offices to get sued under New Mexico Civil Rights Act for trying to enforce this. I think that's kind of the motivation that we saw when we saw the mayor of Albuquerque, Tim Keller, when we saw the Bernalillo County Sheriff, I believe it's Allen, is the Bernalillo County Sheriff currently. When they came out against it, I think it was in a way motivated out of self-interest that they didn't want their officers getting sued under the New Mexico Civil Rights Act for citing somebody for exercising their civil rights. So I think there was a little bit of self-interest in this, and also with the Attorney General, he didn't want to have to waste his staff time on defending something like this that he knew was going to lose in court. So I think it was good to see, but at the same time, there's definitely some self-interest at play in there as well.
Now, this governor, her political career, she could have ended it right there with this. I mean, she does have time to serve out as governor, but she's term limited. If she wants to run for office, I mean, obviously she could run as a legislator, but let's be real. She, I think, at this point would want to run for the U.S. Senate, and that's pretty much all, unless she wanted to run for president. But I think that's really done with this particular move that she undertook. But we do have the legislature up, all 112 members, and with the exception of Joe Cervantes, Senator Cervantes, who opposed the governor, and Mimi Stewart, who supported her, most legislators have been, especially on the Democrat side, plenty of Republicans have condemned her and are taking action, including impeachment proceedings, et cetera. But it does seem to be that the average run-of-the-mill Democrat is running as far away from the issue as possible. Since you're your portfolio is here in New Mexico, and since the legislature does make the laws, it seems like they would be the likeliest kind of group to target with messaging and political efforts to expose their positions and highlight what their positions really are, or their unwillingness to take a position on this issue. So, how do you see, maybe not shooting sports, but NRA and other national organizations? Hopefully, this drives support to some of those races where we can push back against the anti-gun legislators.
Most definitely. I mean, I think this is just me speaking personally. NMSSA is a 501(c)(4) organization. We do not endorse candidates or spend any kind of money on races. We just inform people, what their elected officials are doing. I think the biggest impact this is probably going to have is because it was directed squarely at Albuquerque. The reason that people in Albuquerque are buying firearms is because they see all the time that they see something happening, they're afraid, they call 911 because there's some type of crime happening, maybe even a break-in, and the operator tells them, okay, they'll be there when they get there, and then 2 hour later, a police officer shows up, takes a report, or sometimes they even just tell them to file the report online. You see some type of robbery happening in broad daylight, and they just tell you, oh, file a report online. So people in Albuquerque in particular, they see this crime, and they feel the need to protect themselves because the inability of the government to protect you has been very, very much exposed by this crime crisis that we do have in Albuquerque. So the governor tried to take away people's ability to protect themselves at the same time when the state will not protect you. So particularly, I think of the Northeast Heights of Albuquerque, there's some battleground districts there that I think this could play a big role in. And some of these Democrat legislators, we need to put them on the record and saying, did you support the governor's trying to strip people's ability to protect themselves away? Because the state's not going to protect you. APD's not, unless a priority one call is still like a 15-minute response time for APD, 10 to 15 minutes for priority one. That's, somebody getting shot, somebody getting stabbed. Like, it's a really long response time. So, figure out from there, somebody's breaking into your house, but no one's actually been shot, they might take them a while to get there. So your ability to protect yourself is really, it's in your hands. That's what we kind of emphasize so much. And these people tried to take that ability away from you. So Democrat legislators in Albuquerque need to be held accountable to that and say, did you support the governor doing this? So that's where I think there's going to be a lot of fights over it. We did see some of our allies on the Democratic side in the legislature, like Joseph Sanchez up near Espanola. He came out against this, and he signed a letter with some of the conservative rural Democrats who've been strong allies of ours. I think Joseph Sanchez may actually be a member of NMSSA. He's a Democrat, and we fully support him.
Yeah, I would imagine that rural Democrats, and I don't have a list, but that list of where Democrats stand would be a valuable thing to really spread around and make sure that folks across New Mexico know, because it's not obviously. Albuquerque has become a no-go zone for Republicans by and large, with the exception of Bill Ream and Mark Moores. A few others have parts of Albuquerque, but when it comes to Albuquerque represented by Republicans, it's a vastly different situation than it was, say, a decade ago. But around the state of New Mexico as well, I would think a lot of rural Democrats would want to directly opposed the governor on this. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about the crime specifically. One thing, it was reported by KOB4, the governor emphasizes gun crime, and violent crime is a real issue in the city. It's a real issue in the state, but lawlessness in general is a problem. And the Kohl's at Coronado Center, a big national department store, is closing. Employees said it was crime issue, shoplifting. Walmart in the quote unquote international district, formerly known as the war zone, also closed a while back. I mean, uh, it just seems like the Democrats who control the legislature are the group that should be taking crime a little more seriously. Are you involved in, or does your organization work on crime bills in the legislature to address crime, or is that kind of something that you uh, aren't involved in directly.
Oh, we definitely are involved. So, Representative Bill Ream, who is a member of my organization, every year, he works on good bills to hold criminals accountable. But part of the problem that we have, there's a lot of talk about, what is the legislature doing or what is not what the legislature is not doing. But part of the problem is not just in the legislature; it's in the prosecution. The one thing the governor actually said through this whole thing that was correct, and I think people kind of missed it, is when she attacked Raul Torres for not defending her, she actually correctly observed when he was the district attorney in Bernalillo County, he had a terrible track record of prosecuting people. He would give a plea deal or drop charges against just about everybody. Because what we see, there's a pattern here. When someone commits a major crime, typically what that major crime is the end result of someone committing a bunch of smaller crimes before that and having zero consequences the entire time. So they do something, they get off. They do something else, they get off, because there's this ideology that if you let people get off and not punish people for crimes, it's somehow going to make their behavior better. That's this ideology that's taken over. We see it in Albuquerque, we see it in Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, of this, just let them walk, they'll learn their lesson, and they'll reform themselves. Well, all that we're doing is we're teaching people that crime is legal. When you have, I mean, the percent of property crime that anyone ever serves jail time for, I think it's less than 10% of property crime. It may even be less than 5% will people ever spend time in jail for property crime. So I mean, if in this, I guess I'm not an attorney, I'm not telling you to do this, but in a lot of ways, property crime is legal in New Mexico, because especially in Bernalillo County, because people are normally not caught for it. Even if they are caught, there's no consequences. So what we need to do through prosecution is hold people accountable when they break the law. This is something that Raul Torres refused to do repeatedly, and now he's Attorney General. So now we're going to see this ideology that he had as Bernalillo County District Attorney across the entire state, where they refuse to hold people accountable until they do something major and that makes headlines, and then all of a sudden, okay, now we got to go charge them with something and actually hold and take them to trial or whatnot. So what we need to do is hold people accountable when they do things wrong beforehand, so we don't allow them to continue to escalate these behaviors, because we just see these behaviors of these criminals continuing to escalate until they do something terrible, like shoot somebody in a road rage shooting, and then we hold them accountable. Whereas there were several things that happened before then that you could have hold them accountable. I think it's kind of remarkable. This is something I talk about a lot, that the only people in this state who are ever expected to be accountable for anything are firearm owners who've never hurt anybody. That we're the ones who are supposed to bear the brunt of all this legislation. We're the ones who are bearing the brunt of the governor's ire. Whereas we're the ones who are just trying to protect ourselves and live our lives peacefully, away from all this stuff. But at the same time, we're the ones who are apparently to blame for the crime crisis. The governor genuinely thinks concealed carry permit holders who submit all their fingerprints to the state of New Mexico are the people out there apparently chasing coals in Walmart out of Albuquerque. We're the only ones who ever expected, and we totally agree. People should be accountable for their actions. People need to be responsible for stuff. But right now, the only people the governor thinks should be responsible for anything are gun owners who just want to live their lives peacefully.
Yeah. How about those judges? Those are the people who probably right after Mayor Keller, I would argue, should bear the responsibility for the crime problems. Um, we have judicial elections. It's a convoluted system. Uh, how can you or we work together to hold these judges accountable, because there's such limited information about them? They don't run in partisan races. It's a terrible system, and unfortunately, the voters seem to elect the very worst, least tough on crime judges in our city and state.
Yeah, and I think the problem, a lot of it derives from, kind of the ideology that's taken over significant parts of this state, that, judges run on this type of reform type they call it reform, something like that. Whereas really what it is just very soft on crime. Because, if these reforms worked, we would see Albuquerque become a very safe place. Whereas, Albuquerque today has 3-4 times the murder rate that it did, 10 years ago. These were quote unquote reforms that people have been trying to do make everyone less safe. all that it does is, just puts people on the street to combat with one another until somebody dies. And then I guess under this ideology that they have, if someone gets killed by another criminal, well, then at least they didn't die in jail or something. Like that's kind of their genuine ideology. But what we need to do is, I think, just have a conversation about, like, what is it that we want as a state and as a city? Do we want to allow people to, continue to do things without consequence? Because the path that we've been on, where under all this quote unquote reform, and a lot of it came from the state Supreme Court, and I don't think the state Supreme Court has ever, people ever realized that what all the things that they did to institute this quote unquote reform that's killing people. They've never been held accountable for that. And I think, one of the architects was was it Daniels, the former the chief justice. The amount of damage that he did in the long run of the state, I think we're just now, I mean, we're kind of in the midst of all this damage that the state Supreme Court has done through all these different things to quote unquote reform the criminal justice system, which has really just made a system with zero accountability and responsibility for anybody. So, we can go after individual judges, but I think there's a greater ideology here that we have to combat and say, yes, like we do want to help people, but helping people, we need jobs, we need education, and we're not providing that. So until we have to provide, we have to have economic opportunity for people. We have to have good educational opportunities for people. That way they're not put on these tracks where then you just kind of kick the can down the system until they do something terrible, because that's just the status quo that we're in New Mexico right now. So I think it's really, it's not, when you talk about crime, you have to talk about all the socioeconomic impacts that we have in this state and be realistic about where we're at. That's something that I've been talking about for years. And, the governor very much tried to downplay this stuff in her reelection campaign. So if I don't understand how this is an emergency now when it was just as bad 2 years ago, when she was running for office and she told us it was not an emergency. In fact, everything was fine. This was her message when things were just as bad 2 years ago, but somehow today it's an emergency. So that's kind of, I realize it's kind of a long-winded answer, but
No,
I think
that's okay.
there's an underlying ideology, and this is kind of where I think, we have some of that shared interest in people who do believe in personal responsibility, people who do believe in economic opportunity, people who do believe that, our education system is not working the way that it was intended to, because all these issues ultimately are connected in some way, shape, or form.
Well, I definitely would like to see a more robust approach to the judges, because there are some retention elections and some ways that we can go about them. But that's strategically a topic for another time, and we'll definitely get to that at some point. But let's talk about the specific incidents that precipitated all this in the first place. And it kind of highlights some of these issues we're just talking about. At least I believe it will once information is found, because the incident involved a car cutting off another car outside of Isotopes Park, and then the second car essentially doing a U-turn and coming back and firing 17 bullets into this unknown car, killing an 11-year-old child and injuring another person at least. Now, the governor, of course, wants to blame guns, but clearly this was not a stable person. This was not a person who, my bet is that this individual or these individuals had already been engaged with the criminal justice system. It just strikes me as these are the types of people that should be in jail for a very long time, probably for incidents they committed before this.
Mhm.
But anyway, have you heard anything? Is there any kind of movement in terms of the case finding these people? I think that'll be a very significant event if and when it happens. More significant if it never happens, and that's kind of the dog that doesn't bark, is that this person or these people just go away and are never found, which is going to be extremely disappointing if that happens.
So, to address this incident and other incidents that happen, like, it is an absolute tragedy that we have had so many children in New Mexico needlessly killed, um, killed by firearms, killed through abuse and neglect in our CYFD system that is utterly incapable of protecting children. It is an absolute tragedy. And yes, we need to have Like I said, we need to have a conversation about who we are as a city, who we are as a state to address this stuff because it's on all of us that these sorts of things keep happening. Um, I From my experience and stuff like this in the past, I think we're probably going to see that the individuals involved in this probably have dealt with the criminal justice system, and they learn through their experiences with the criminal justice system that crime is legal, because that's what we've been teaching them, that crime is legal. Go shoot up, cut somebody cuts you off, unload an entire magazine into their car, because that's what we've been teaching them. That's what Raul Torres has been teaching people like this. That's what these soft on crime judges have been teaching them, that crime is legal, so go ahead, do whatever you want, there's going to be no consequences to it. This is not a normal, the idea that this is somehow just a normal reaction to unload an entire handgun magazine into a car for cutting them off. That's not anything normal. That's not, it's a disgusting behavior. These people should, basically serve the rest of their lives in jail for doing what they did. And they probably should have been in jail in the first place and never been out free to do something like this. So it's, it's disturbing what is happening. I mean, I will be the first to say, because we've been talking about how bad the crime is in Albuquerque for some time. But like I said, we've been talking about over and over again that we have a system that teaches people crime is legal, so they continue to escalate their behaviors until they do something like this. That's the same story with so many of these other cases, like with CYFD. Because the governor has also refused to do anything to reform CYFD, and they continue to act in this manner to protect themselves over the welfare of New Mexico children. That parents in these abusive situations learn they can do whatever they want. CYFD is not going to step in and stop them and take their children away. So they keep doing things until these kids die, and it happens over and over and over again in New Mexico. So we have like I've said so many times where we have a system where there is no accountability. We have a system where there's no responsibility, unless you're a member of the NRA or something like that. Then apparently you're supposed to be responsible, but everybody else in the state is not supposed to be responsible for their actions. That's the ideology this governor has. That's the ideology Raul Torres has. And so instead of real solutions, she does these stunts in court that we have to sue her over. And I will sue her every single time she does something like this. I've sued her but once before, sued her again this time. And we're open to doing that again. But it's this ideology that this governor and this attorney general have, and many of our state legislators too, if we're being honest. People like Mimi Stewart, they have this ideology where just do whatever you want, there's no consequences, and somehow it's supposed to make everything better. Well, it's not. People are dying, and it needs to change.
All right. Well, thank you for that impassioned plea. And no, I hear you. And this governor tries to kind of claim the high ground here, like she's the only person that cares about these incidents and the kids and the families, and it's just a bunch of Republicans who aren't serious about crime when we're a supermajority Democrat legislature, and she obviously was unable or unwilling to get her own party to act in the last few legislative sessions on crime and crime-related issues. So I appreciate that. Well, our time is short here, and I want to give you a chance to offer any additional thoughts. There's obviously a lot going on in this area, and things that we may have missed, or ideas that should be discussed that haven't been fleshed out. So, anything that you want people to know about before we let you go?
I think what I said at the very beginning of this, even if you don't care about the issue of Second Amendment or firearms, you should care about the amount of executive power. This is something a CNN anchor, actually, of all people, called out the governor for. Is like, even if you support this type of action, should a single executive have this much power? And the answer is absolutely not. We've seen a lot of abuse of executive actions by this governor. Fortunately, this time, we were able to stop her. We've got some really great partners. I also want to say, if you support what we're doing, please support New Mexico Shooting Sports Association. Also, please go support Second Amendment Foundation and Firearms Policy Coalition. They have some fantastic attorneys who are doing good work for the people in New Mexico on this lawsuit. So we're going to continue to pursue this governor, and we're expecting, this upcoming 30-day session, crime and guns are going to be a big part of it. it's going to be pretty intense. So if you support, if you want to get involved in this issue, please, we need your help. We're going to have a really intense 30-day legislative session. It was already going to be really intense. Basically, we know that a lot of the bills, that the really terrible bills that failed in the 60-day session, are coming right back in the 30-day session. So we're going to have our hands full. It's going to be a really intense 30 days. So please, if you want to get more involved, go visit our website, nmssa.org. Sign up for our email alerts. They're totally free, and we'll get you plugged in with all that you need to know about gun politics in New Mexico.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Appreciate your time, Zach. And yeah, we will here at the Rio Grande Foundation also be keeping up on this particular issue, especially as we come up on the 30-day session and holding legislators accountable, as well as reforming our emergency rules in the state of New Mexico. We tried in the wake of COVID. Democrats would never jump on board. Just one who's now retired, but having some restrictions in our emergency laws in the state of New Mexico on the subject matter for which an emergency can be declared, whether it's guns or climate change, another exciting issue. So,
Yes.
all right. Thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointsnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to the show at Apple, Stitcher, or tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.